to talk about today. Those products are the distribution future energy scenarios, the network development plans that we've all been publishing, and similarly the coordination registers that we've all been publishing. And then at the end, there'll be next steps from me and any other business, any questions you may have, in addition to the questions that you can ask as we go through the individual product presentations. So we can move on a slide, please, Helen. And again, please. Thank you very much. Just as a bit of a recap, the Open Networks project at its core is collaboration between 9 electricity system operators. The aim is to support the move to net zero emissions by the transformation of our electricity networks into ones that are both flexible and smart. The Open Networks project started now, well, it's been going now 5 years, and there have been plenty of notable achievements. If you're looking at local flexibility markets, we've standardized across the whole of the distribution network companies the flexibility products. We've got standard working arrangements, and we've moved forward with connection of customers in a faster manner by a standard contract for everybody. We've been sharing more data. The embedded capacity register is a perfect example of that. And we're seeking to deliver efficiency between network operators. And I think some of the products that we'll be talking about today will touch on a lot of these areas. We're going to be focusing on the whole electricity system work stream, for which I'm the chair. If you see on the graphic in front of you, you can see that well, the graphic there shows you that there are actually 4 basic work streams within the Open Networks projects, aided and abetted by a comms and stakeholder engagement work stream. The one we're focusing on today is the T&D coordination. So if we move on a slide, please, Helen. So we can see today's whole electricity system is made up of 6 products. We've got 2 products that are focused mainly on operation and coordination of data, which is looking at visibility of distributed energy resource and operational data for energy resource, distributed energy resource. Today, though, we are focusing more on the right-hand side of that graphic, where we'll be looking at the future energy scenarios, the distribution network development plan, and the whole electricity system coordination. I won't steal the thunder of the individuals who are going to present now, so without further ado, I'll hand you over to Christos, who will take you through the distributed future energy scenarios. Over to you, Christos.
Thanks, Ian, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm Christos Kaloudas. I'm the Capacity Strategy Manager with Electricity Northwest and the product lead in Workstream 1B, Product 2, that focuses on energy scenarios. So when we're talking about energy scenarios, at high level, these are grouped into 2 categories. We're talking about the DFES and FES. DFES are the distribution future energy scenarios. These are produced by each of the 6 distribution network operators, DNOs, across Great Britain. And all of them are local. You can find in them local bottom-up scenarios for electricity demand, distributed generation, and storage. So you can find more information across the 6 DNOs and their DFES in reports, datasets, and heat maps online. And we also have the future energy scenarios. These are produced by National Grid's electricity system operator, and these are national scenarios for electricity demand, but they also expand to gas, hydrogen demand. There is also information around transmission connected generation and distributed generation and storage. Similarly to DFES, in the FES you can also find reports and datasets online available. And our latest effort from the ESO is to improve the regional trends that appear in FES, so you can find the information around regional FES that aims to capture local trends, including use of bottom-up information from the DFES. And there's also new interactive documents available. So if we can move to the next slide, please. This presentation focuses more on the DFES, on the distribution future electricity, future energy scenarios, and their use in network planning. So what are they? They are long-term forecasts of demand generation and storage, as I already mentioned, and this extends to associated components such as, for example, volumes of low-carbon technologies like electric vehicles and heat pumps, installed capacities for generation, and other information. When we talk about the long-term forecast, these appear as a set of scenarios that aim to capture the future uncertainties. And we have 4 scenarios that follow a common framework with National Grid's ESO future energy scenarios. And also there's a 5th scenario that is a best use scenario, and we are going to, that applies only to DFES, not to FES. And we're going to talk more around this in the next slides. The purpose of DFES, there are different purposes for the DFES. We need to keep in mind that the primary purpose of DFES is that they are used for the strategic planning of distribution systems and networks. So that's their primary use. The future networks need to secure supply and secure the capacity required to meet the demand and generation growth in the DFES scenarios. But beyond this primary purpose, there are secondary purposes of the DFES. The DFES can at the same time support local stakeholder decarbonization and other plans. So any information from local stakeholders and about their plans is fed into DFES, and doing that, DNOs make sure that they will release the capacity required to facilitate all these plans. They can also support the local area energy plans and climate action plans, and this is again, similarly, any information around local area energy plans can be used as a direct input into DFES, making sure that the future capacity and in electricity distribution networks will be adequate to facilitate these plans. And another purpose of DFES is also to support the National Grid's ESO FES that cover the whole of the country. So information, DNOs are best positioned to understand, to capture information from local stakeholders, information from for example, from connections for demand generation, for plant developments, for partnerships between local authorities and enterprises. And all that information can be used to, and is shared also with the ESO to improve the ESO FES. Now, as you can understand from what I've just said, the role of stakeholder engagement is critical to improve DFES and their utility. These plans are reflected in the local stakeholder plans are reflected in DFES, and as I already mentioned, DFES is a vehicle to release capacity and facilitate the stakeholder plans. But we need to keep in mind that this is a bidirectional engagement, because stakeholders share their plans, and DNOs and DSOs provide help and advice based on these forecasts. And so the information from DFES and other planning documents that use DFES as an input is shared with stakeholders and allows them to improve their plans. If we can move to the next slide, please. So DFES is a standardized process, and it's a core process around network planning. You can see in this graph that in the top that stakeholder engagement is a key part of improving the DFES. It's a bidirectional flow, as I've just mentioned, and DFES is actually used as an input to standardized planning processes. These are the long-term development statement and the network development plan. The long-term development statement is describing the future distribution network requirements for the next 5 years, It's published by all DNOs but every November. It's a license condition for all DNOs, and there is a May update again annually. The network development plan is a new license condition. It's part of the clean energy package and details future requirements for the networks for 1 to 10 years beyond publications. The first NDP was published in May 2022 across all DNOs. It's a biannual cycle, but please keep in mind that many DNOs have already decided to publish this as an annual cycle. So you'll see at least a biannual publication for the NDPs, but for some DNOs you'll see an annual refresh as well. Next slide, please. So talking about the scenarios in DFES, at high level we have 5 scenarios. 4 of them are common with the future scenarios that National Grid ESO is producing, and there is a 5th best use scenario. You can see on the left-hand side in this slide the common scenario framework that both DNOs and TSO are using for the 4 scenarios that follow this framework. There are 2 axes here that define this framework. There's a horizontal axis that defines the speed of decarbonization. So in other words, the scenarios that are towards the right of this axis have an accelerated decarbonization to meet net zero. The scenario that is on the left, it's not meeting net zero. Please keep in mind that in the 4 scenarios here, it's for the scenarios produced in 2021. Steady progression that appears in the bottom left corner will be replaced in this year by the falling short scenario, which will have the same high-level rationale. We also have another axis here, the vertical axis that is around the level of societal change. So a scenario that is higher in this axis considers higher levels of societal change, so people adopt behaviors that are more in line to a transition to net zero. So they might adopt more EVs, they take more efficiency measures, and this is reflected in the scenarios. The 5th scenario is the best use scenario that we're going to talk more about in the following slides, and it's better to cover it in the next slide. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So the best use scenario is defined for every DNO as the scenario that is able to capture the highest certainty in trends. And when we talk about high certainty, we focus in a horizon that extends from 1 year ahead up to 10 years ahead, acknowledging that longer term uncertainties are significant, and we cannot really talk about high certainty in horizons beyond 10 years. So to produce a best use scenario, every building block, so every forecasting component needs to be checked against 3 categories to justify this high certainty. So you can see in this graph that these 3 categories are that the best use scenario, in order to capture high certainty, it needs first of all to align with existing and national policies. So for example, a scenario needs to align with national policies to meet net zero by 2050. It also needs to, so that's the first category. The second category is that it needs to use justified stakeholder engagement inputs. So it needs to consider information from local plant developments, from connections activity, for information that gives us some certainty on what is expected on the ground at local level. And it also needs to use justified inputs for regional and local characteristics. So for example, it needs to consider the very local characteristics for things like the building stock, local socioeconomics, so things that might differentiate one area from another. Let's discuss about a bit more around these 3 categories in the next slide. This slide pack focuses a lot on providing you with an understanding of this best use scenario because this best use scenario is used in the network development plans together with the other scenarios. It was introduced last year, so many of you might be familiar with FES scenarios or other scenarios, but we want to use this opportunity to provide you with more information around this best use scenario. So if we can move to the next slide, please. Thank you. So here is some more information around these three categories that we're talking about a need to be used to justify, they're used as justification criteria to produce the best use scenario. So we are saying that the best use scenario, first of all, uses justification criteria for alignment with existing and announced policies. As I said, this means that we need the best use scenario needs to comply with national policies such as the 2050 net zero target. But given that this is a scenario that needs to capture the high certainty trends, we are allowed to consider local policies if we can justify that these prevail over national policies. So, for example, for areas where we might have air quality zones that can influence local behaviors of customers to adopt EVs sooner than other areas, this needs to be captured in best use scenario. And the reason is that these local policies prevail over national policies for this in this area. When, regarding the second justification criteria, second set of justification criteria that is around stakeholder engagement inputs, this is very much relevant to the pipeline of projects that DNOs are expected to connect and increase demand or generation at local level. So at high level, we can group these developments in two categories. One is projects for which there is an associated connection code. So a customer has made an application to connect to the network, and DNOs are justifying to the likelihood of these projects to proceed or meet specific amount of demand compared to the contracted capacity using different ways. So, for example, you can see that some DNOs will use detailed information around some projects. Some other DNOs for projects that are connected at lower voltages might use information around the historical performance of similar projects that connected recently, and using that historical performance, they can justify the assessment, the assumptions they use in forecasts. So it's information around these projects that are likely to connect in the short term. But beyond projects that are in the connections pipeline, BestView also needs to capture plant developments without an associated connection code. So, for example, it can be regional strategic developments that are part of local authority spatial frameworks, for example. It can be projects that there is no associated connection code, but the DNOs need to consider them if there is high certainty associated with them. So, for example, when we talk about high certainty, it can be projects where we can demonstrate that there is strong backing from local or central government, there is secure funding, there is ongoing development work. So all this evidence is can provide us with the confidence that there is high certainty for these projects to move forward. The last category is the local characteristics, as I talked earlier. So again, it's that we need to capture that what applies to a local area can drive future trends. So just to give you an example on that, possibly it's better to give a practical example. You can see one of the key components in forecasting for all DNOs is the demand associated with heat pumps, with electric heat pumps. That is part of the electrification of heating. What it means for, you can see in DNOs that there are different, in the DFES, that there are different trends of heat pumps across the scenarios, but the BestView needs to consider things happening on the ground. So, for example, if an area has high access to the gas grid, the customers in that area have high access to the gas network. It cannot be. We are expecting that there will be low uptakes of heat pumps because these customers won't be the first adopters of these technologies. Also, depending on the building stock, some buildings for some buildings, a heat pump might look as a more efficient technology in the short term. So it's these local characteristics that can affect these trends in the best use scenario, and best use scenario needs to consider these local characteristics to justify the certainty in the next 1 to 10 years. Moving to the next slide, please. That is, I think, the last one in this in my slide pack. I want to capture a couple of points here around the use of the scenarios in the network development plan that Rita will cover more in her presentation after mine. So, as I said earlier, the primary purpose of DFES is that they are used to inform network planning, and network plans are described and published in the network development plans, plan documents across all DNOs. So a key question is what scenarios inform an NDP? And what you need to have in mind is that the use of best use scenario is mandatory for the NDP, but at the same time, it doesn't mean that the network development plans are informed by a single scenario. The DNOs can choose to use more scenarios, and I would say that it's important that they do consider the full range of scenarios. And by doing that, we can reflect the short-term uncertainties using a range of scenarios, but importantly, we can capture the long-term uncertainties that are critical in our in electricity distribution network planning for things, for example, like the uncertainties around the future role of hydrogen or the amount of or other technologies as well. Second question that we need to have in mind, and the answer for that is, why do we need a best use scenario network development plan? So there is a lot of works around energy scenarios or decarbonization pathways. That is a different thing. These are not forecasts, and we need to, by providing more information and clarity with the best use scenario, we remove from stakeholders the complexity of multiple scenarios, and we help them understand let's say, our best use for the local demand and generation trends over the next 1 to 10 years. At the same time, we can provide the highest certainty basis for assessing network impacts and the need for interventions. And the best use scenario can work well with the other scenarios, and it can support a best use network development plan together with the scenarios and other network factors. So I think this is the last slide in my presentation, and I would like to thank you for following the slides, and I'm now looking for any questions or any comments from your side. So any questions? Yes, Lisa?
Hi, thank you for the presentation. In terms of providing some investment signals, do the DNOs hope to move to a much more proactive way of investing? You know, so you invest and they will come, rather than getting stuck in what we appear to be stuck in a nightmare with the TOs, whereby they ran out of capacity and seem to have been unable totally to keep up with what's going on. I mean, the anticipatory investment that's required if you get all of the EVs and heat pumps looks absolutely enormous. Is this process going to help you inform that?
I would say that it's a decision from every DNO to define their strategy to release capacity through, let's say, investing ahead of need or reactively. The purpose of DFES is that we need to make sure that future networks secure this capacity. Now, if your question is more around, the way I would answer your question is that the DFES can at high level help us understand what levels of capacity are required, let's say in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. Then it's more of a question of a strategy for every DNO to support, more like investing ahead of need or afterwards, like bringing investment ahead of need or not. I would say it's beyond the scope of my slides. It's more around the strategy for every DNO and how Ofgem is receiving that. And I'm sure there is no, I'm afraid there is no easy answer to that, Lisa. Don't know if you wanted to add anything, Ian.
Yeah, I think the answer to Lisa's question is really a combination of the work that you're doing and the work of the network development plan in the longer term, and in the shorter term, and the long-term development statement, which is currently under review by Ofgem. So Lisa, when you've heard Rita Shaw's presentation later, I hope that will, together with Christos's presentation, bring it all together on how we plan to highlight areas where we can engage with flexibility and with generation out there, encourage them to connect in the right places for us as we see our network developing. So, Lisa, if we haven't answered your question fully by the end of Rita's presentation, please shout again, and we'll try again to make sure that we responded to you.
Thank you.
Christos, and there is another question from Chiamaka.
Yep.
Hi, my question is with regards to the DFES. So is it my understanding that each of the DNOs would publish their own DFES? So there's going to be like 6 DFES reports. And if that is the case, I think it will be helpful to probably have a consolidated report that has, like, you know, all the DFES that maybe, you know, it would be the case that maybe like one of the scenarios will feature the highlights from all the DNO's DFESs, if that makes sense.
Thanks, Chiamaka, for the question. I have to say, yes, it's the case that all DNOs are producing their DFES. It's since, I would say, the last 3-4 years, and it's part of the standardization across all these works that we've worked in this product to standardize and have a common scenario framework, so you can find 4 common scenarios with the same rationale. So it can, my understanding is that this helps readers of the DFES reports to understand that we are talking about these scenarios. I would say that please keep in mind that every DFES document is also capturing the stakeholder engagement that every DNO is doing with their local stakeholders, and captures what is happening at their locality. And that's the reason of the DFES, to really provide more information that is relevant to, for example, for our case, for the northwest of England, for other DNOs, for the north of south of Scotland, for example, rather than providing more information around the national picture. It's the process that we do with National Grid GSO and their effort to regionalize FES, that we are sharing more information from DFES that is captured in the FES. So for example, you can see that information from DG distributed generation is captured now in FES. I would say it's more around the value of the DFES for the local communities that they refer to. Try to capture the point you want to make. I would say that possibly it's worth if we try and communicate in DFES more around things that are standardized across the DFES, because if someone wants really to see what's happening across multiple areas and the level of detail that we go into the DFES, it can help them understand progress towards standardization.
Yeah, exactly my point. Rather than having to go into each of the DFESs, just to like have visibility across the board, what's happening, because like you said, the FAIRS doesn't necessarily provide that, and then the DFAIRS is a bit too different, like is a bit too specific on one particular area. So if it just gets into that mutual, that sweet spot in between, that'll be great.
Yeah, thank you. Any other question? No. Back to you, Ian. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, Christos. If there's any other questions later on, please feel free to ask those questions either in the chat or at the end of all the presentations under any other business. So now we're moving on to the network development plans, which is product 5, and the lead on product 5 is my colleague Rita Shaw from UK Power Networks. So I'll leave you in Rita's capable hands.
Good afternoon, everybody. So Christos has set the kind of the whole system background of how all of the DFAIRS scenarios use that common framework of scenario worlds. What I'm going to do, if you move on to the next slide, please, is to give you the context of how that's been taken forward, specifically this year, as part of all of the DNOs delivering on a new regulatory requirement called the Network Development Plans. So at the beginning of May, all the DNOs published a medium-term view reflecting that their best view plan based on the best view scenario and the context of that wider set of scenarios that sets out network development plans for each of their license areas. It takes 2021 as its baseline, and specifically the network as of November 2021 that we published a lot of detail on in our long-term development statements. And then it's looking forward with a focus over the next 10 years to share what infrastructure and flexibility services we're looking ahead to delivering, what, where, and some of the context of why, so that stakeholders can understand what's happening in terms of infrastructure development and flexibility services that are likely to be built or procured over that time frame. The license condition that we're picking up had a focus on a 5 to 10 year framework, but as you'll see in the next slide, what we've actually done in terms of, if you move on to the next slide, please, Helen, thank you. In terms of interpreting that regulatory requirement, we're looking, although there's a focus on 10 years out, we're actually looking in at setting that in the longer term context. So we've got 3 elements within the network development that have all been published for every license area. We have the network development report. That's the kind of the headline part I've already talked about, which is what are we going to do both in terms of infrastructure and flex services. So it's the high level plans for what's happening at the highest distribution voltages down to the lower voltage of the primary substation. But then we're setting that in the context of a set of headroom tables which cover all of the grid and primary substations that we already publish information about in the long-term development statement, and indicating headroom figures for demand and generation over time to 2050 in all of the DFAIRS scenarios that we've talked about already, and importantly where a DNO has also set out a best view scenario that's separate from the DFAIRS, it would also publish those headroom scenarios for that best view scenario. Different DNOs have taken different approaches. Some of them have identified one of the DFAIRS scenarios as their best view. Some of the DNOs have identified an additional scenario, which is their best view. And the third part of what's been published by each DNO is a methodology document, which explains how we are approaching the questions of how to work within this uncertainty about how the country will decarbonise, both at a local and a national level, and describe how we've produced those headroom tables and the end-to-end process and assumptions that we've taken to justify our plans for network developments, both the infrastructure and the flexibility services one. And I'll pick up a little bit here on Lisa's question from earlier, and then probably come back to it at the end. We were asked about how this relates to how the scenarios from DFES relate to what investment is actually made. So as you probably all know, the DNOs are regulated businesses. We have a price control arrangement with Ofgem, and in the last year we have all been putting forward our plans for the next price control period called RIIO-ED2 to Ofgem, and Ofgem is due to be making its initial decisions on those investment plans pretty shortly. We'll be getting the first the kind of the what's called like the initial part of the Ofgem decision. So given the timing of this first NDP, the infrastructure and flexibility services developments which DNOs have been proposing here are going to be pretty closely aligned to what DNOs have also been putting into their RIIO-ED2 business plans. So there is a part of the kind of decision point around what's in the plans and what's in strategies for something like, yeah, in terms of level of justification and potentially anticipatory investment, or making sure that investments are really justified and there isn't excessive expenditure, which is costing bill payers. And that kind of strategy, that balance of is the investment justified versus what's the appropriate anticipatory investment if there is one, looking across the range of scenarios, that's the sort of thing which Ofgem will be taking a view on as part of the assessment of each DNO's business plans. But each DNO business plan will very much be influenced by the work we've been discussing here about undertaking, going from that high level national set of scenario worlds and making sure that it's then related to the lower level, more regional interpretations in the DFES, and is taken absolutely down to the DFES primary purpose of planning on the distribution networks. So this absolutely sets the context of what we are proposing to do, but there will one of the things that we'll pick up as we go through the presentation is that when we set out the set of investments that these scenarios in our network analysis suggests is justified, the network development reports will flag whether that's something already in delivery, very close to delivery, those sort of things that would have potentially already been in our long-term development statements, which cover the next 5 years, or whether it's signposting to those slightly more medium-term things out to 10 years, which will be more influenced by the treatment and the steer that we get in our business plans. Okay, coming back, hope that was helpful. I'm happy to pick up a bit more at the end, but if we go back to the main slides pack, Helen, if you go on to the next slide, I'll give some context about what has been produced. So in terms of the network development plan, the regulatory requirement, what was actually set out in law at the end of 2020 was a kind of a statutory instrument, part of a regulation on the electricity licensees at quite high level, and the DNOs have worked together with transmission reps as well through the ANO Open Networks project to take the high level requirements that came from Ofgem in the NDP and turn it in to a detailed form of statement for standardization of network development plans across all DNOs. kind of intermediate stage of this was end of 2020 producing a standard network capacity report template, and then the first version of that was published August 2021, and then at the end of December 21 we produced the detailed draft of what is in the network development plans, setting out what every DNO needs to produce so that we could then all deliver on that framework for this May's publication. So if we go on to the next slide there, and it's been a really useful feedback loop in terms of taking the very high level regulatory requirements in the legal text into something which is much more detailed, setting out the network development reports, the network headroom reports, and the methodology document, and to be able to produce the form of statement and to be able to test out both with stakeholders on how we've defined those, and also test out that once we had defined how the NDP was going to work, and when we've gone through another loop of review of now that we've all produced an NDP, were there actually any differences in how we've interpreted what the plan was in terms of a common framework? And that's one of the areas we've been looking at now. So if we go on to the next slide, please. At the top of the screen, there's the link to the form of statement that we've all been working with. I'll put the link to that in the meeting chat in a moment, because that's published on the ENA's website. So, and at high level, it's giving standardized headings for the network headroom report. So it's using the substation names from the long-term development statement and indicating for each substation its voltage, the bulk supply point that it's related to, and the grid supply point, the GSP, that it's related to, the location of that substation, and the level of headroom for demand and generation in megawatts, and that's given per scenario and per year. And then, so that's the multiple scenario long-term context in which we're planning. And then taking it back down to the best view scenario, we are publishing this sort of information shown on the slide here about what flexibility services and new infrastructure we are expecting to deliver, as well as some of the context that I gave earlier about whether this is a fully confirmed in delivery type investment, or whether it's something that is much more signposting, as in this is what we're expecting to be delivering in 2028, 2029. On the next slide, please. So if we give some, if I put a little bit of flesh around what you'd see in the network headroom report, for example. So there'll be tables of data in the standard format that are being produced by each DNO, and for each individual substation, you'll be able to see the trend of how much unused capacity there is expected to be over time in that substation. Obviously, greater uncertainty as we go forward. So starting from the 2021 picture. So I think this might be a this is probably actually I hadn't updated the dates on the slide from last year, but yeah, the 1st of May 2022 NDP publication is based on a 2021 baseline, and then as both known and hypothetical projects connect in the future, we see that picture of how the level of unused capacity is reducing over time. So for this hypothetical substation here, this is indicating that it's around the 2028 mark that the unused capacity on that substation is then being exhausted, which gives a clear indication that there should be some kind of planned intervention at that substation to be able to facilitate the future development needs. The tables here won't tell you whether that's a kind of a physical capacity infrastructure development or a flexibility services, but that's the kind of detail that then the network development report in parallel will test out and give you more information on. And also, because some of these things could be some time away, there may be a process, for example, for DNOs that are following a market test first, a flexibility first approach, that they'll take the time to try and procure in advance, for example, flexibility services. And if those services aren't available at a sensible price compared to infrastructure investment, or if the scale of the infrastructure investment just makes it justified, then this gives us the early visibility to be able to invest appropriately going forward. So this is very much helping us to ensure that where it comes to interventions, be they infrastructure or flexibility, which take some time to develop, that we've got that early insight to be able to make those decisions. One thing I'd like to pick up on the next slide, though, is that these are very much scenario-based approaches. They'll be informed by real projects, but this is a bit different to what you might see in a heat map. So a heat map would have a single value right now. So if we take a numerical example, let's say that you started off and you might have 20 megawatts of unused capacity on a substation immediately. If you've got 15 megawatts, 5 megawatt connections right now that are contracted, they could use up all of that 5 megawatts. So on a heat map style presentation of this data, you'd have a single value saying, okay, we have 5 megawatts, which is not contractually committed to anyone else. But actually what we're doing in the NDP is a slightly different view of things. It's still saying that actually what you've got unused right now is the 20 megawatts, but it's looking at how we think on a scenario basis that will be reducing over time. And that gives a bit more context about how the scenarios develop over time. And it's very important from the perspective of justifying what is and giving visibility of what future investments would be. So if we go on to the next slide, all of the DNOs have now published their network development plans. They're freely available. You do not need to get any, they are available to anybody. It's not that you have to register or have a specific status. There might be a portal that you might have to do a simple registration for, but the intention within this is to make this data openly available and be standardized on the definitions, although there'll be some variations in terms of the presentation. So now that we have published those and we've done some work on comparing how we've done those, we're now very much looking forward to the next stages and thinking about how potentially we do some of this differently in the future. So the first part of this, if we go on to the next slide, is thinking about areas for future clarification within the network development plan. So it's things like being clear about that unused capacity rather than contractually available capacity approach that was built into the NDP, and being clear about how that will relate to heat maps, particularly with the context that in future developments of the long-term development statement requirements, the LTDS, which we mentioned earlier, that's expected to bring in new requirements for heat map style publications. We're going to be looking at things like approaches to consultation. Different DNOs did that quite differently. There's a few things where we can see room for improvement and clarification in the form of statement that we've already published, and that's things like the upper and lower voltage boundary, the units, the scope of the infrastructure projects in the report, whether it's including or excluding those that are being done for asset health reasons as opposed to the level of demand or generation, and essentially drilling into some of those differences in approach between what's being done in the long-term development statement in the network headroom report, those tables I mentioned, and the infrastructure developments in the network development report. The other big area of clarification, if we move on to the next slide, Helen, is actually slightly beyond the scope of the network development plans. The network development plans are very much distribution license conditions, but the transmission distribution interface, those are not the distribution network operators' assets, and therefore they were out of the scope of the NDP. But as many of you are aware, the level of capacity at a grid supply point and on the wider transmission system can be absolutely material to what developments and connections are possible on the distribution network. So we're now doing some parallel work looking at future recommendations outside the NDP and the potential for how there could be better standardized reporting of developments and of capacity at the grid supply points, noting that the network development plan picks up lower voltages on the distribution network, and that the electricity 10-year statement for the transmission system picks it up at higher voltages. So that's an area that we are now looking to make recommendations on. So the final slide I've got is looking forward. So we're now trying to, now that we've delivered on this first set of NDPs, is to bring together all of those future recommendations, and we'll be looking to pick that up by the end of this year, potentially with recommendations for the evolution of that form of statement, bringing in internal and external inputs, recommending what future work we think there could be to improve the NDPs, and recommendations for how the NDP is governed in the future. Should it continue to be a form of statement owned by the Open Networks group, kind of as a product group as it has been? Should it be an engineering recommendation? And probably most importantly, how it relates to other publications which have overlaps and are potentially related to things like the LTDS, the ECR, the embedded capacity registers, the DFES, which are very much related, and we know that stakeholders would rather that there was more consistency and less duplication in this space. So I appreciate I went over slightly because I was trying to answer Lisa's question right from the beginning, but any other, can I take any questions?
I think, Rita, you must have explained yourself very well, because there's nothing in the chat and there's no hands raised. So I think we shall move on. But as I say, if any questions occur to anybody, Rita will be available to help you answer some of those questions at the end anyway.
Thank you.
Moving on a slide, please, Helen, and we're moving now on to the whole electricity system coordination register. Again, colleague of mine, Gareth Freeman, will pick this up and take you through what we've been doing on this year. Over to you, Gareth.
Thanks, Ian. Yes, hello, my name is Gareth Freeman, and I'll be talking through Product 9 of Workstream 1B, which is our whole electricity system coordination register. Now, Product 9 is a working group that has been operational since around June 2021, and it was created on the back of the implementation of license conditions D17, which covers transmission, and 7A, which covers distribution. Now, these license conditions were created to enforce whole system collaboration between electricity transmission owners, transmission licensees, and electricity distributors. This means that network owners are now required to coordinate and cooperate with other transmission licensees and electricity distributors in order to build a common understanding of where actions taken by one transmission licensee or electricity distributor could have cross-network impacts. And it's really important that when we do these activities, we highlight both positive and negative so we can all learn collectively. So by introducing this license condition, it was envisioned that whole system coordination will identify actions and processes that advance the efficient and economical operation of the total system. Now, on top of this, licensees must consider actions proposed by transmission system users which seek to advance the efficient and economical operation of its network. The licensee must use all reasonable endeavours to implement actions or processes identified or proposed when the proposed will not negatively impact its network and when it is in the interest of the efficient and economical operation of the total system. So effectively, each licensee had the requirement to publish Electricity Whole System Activity Register 12 months from May 2021, and this is the start of the license condition, with a requirement to refresh this data annually. So breaking it down is we had several networks across the UK, and each one was working positively towards whole system collaboration. And this actual license was a way of logging all of the work ongoing in this space so we can all collectively learn together. And it was actually throughout the actual working group itself and undertaking the license condition and publishing it, I definitely found it quite a worthwhile activity. If we just go to the next slide, please. So the coordination register itself is broken into two main parts. And the first part of it is activities and actions. So if you're to go on one of our whole system registers, which are located on each DNO and TO's website, you'll see that this is the first page, and this is responsible for logging every activity that we undertake that we would class as whole electrical system and all subsequent actions that come from it. And we broke it down into a number of headers. So each activity or action will have a unique identifier. So if you are to contact us and want to know more about a particular action or activity, you would use that unique identifier. And it's a way of us continuing a thread as we continue something, as coming into the business, analysing it, seeing if it works well, right through to BAU. A description of the activity, so just describing what it does and how it relates to the whole system. A timeline, so when we started it, so you can actually, So yeah, timeline, so date of initiation, status and updates. Relevance, so also why is it related to the whole system? And we also said that we'd signpost any data in relation to each project. Generally, it's a link to our webpage, signposting particular activities or processes, or else something on the ENA website. Impacts, so a brief description along whether it's positive, neutral or negative. Now this is actually really important as well because this ties into the license condition, where if we see something that has a positive or neutral impact, doesn't adversely affect the network, we have to actually analyze to see whether we'll implement it or not. But when it's negative and we have it signposted as negative, it can save us a lot of time, and it means 6 different DNOs aren't doing the same thing 6 different ways. We already know, well, this way works or it doesn't work, and we can move on. And the latest stage in justification. And this is a really good way of logging the life cycle of an activity and see whether it comes into business as usual, because you can see the latest stage and if we're justifying the next stage. If you just go to the next stage, please, or next page. The user suggestions, and this one I'm actually really excited about, and I'm hoping to get some traction on this today, is user suggestions. So you'll see that we have a link in the slides that we sent out after this, a link to everyone's whole system activity register. And each DNO and TO will have their own unique webs or email that you can email your questions to. I represent ENWL, and we have our own one as well. It's on our webpage. And you, the user, can actually feedback what you'd like to see as a whole system activity or something. Having read through ours, you like to say, well, you'd like to question it or query one or 2 points, or you'd like to suggest something new. Again, once you've done that, you'll log it and you can see it being put on the next update of the register. So you'd be given a unique identifier, categorized based on your user, so whether you're domestic customer, commercial, combined authority, etc. When it came in, the suggestion date, what the suggestion was, relevance to whole system, description of the action taken. So if we get something and we think it's relevant to whole system, we'll review it and take it through the whole life cycle and decide whether to go with it or not yet, or not at all. And you'll be able to see that life cycle. If you go to the next slide, please. And like I said, there is a number of links all to everyone's whole electrical system register. And I recommend that you look at the ones related to your particular patch. And yeah, see what you find. If you have any questions, definitely be willing to get feedback on it. So that was a very short and sweet presentation on the whole system register, but I'm happy to take any questions on it if you have any. Doesn't look like
Once again, Gareth, it must be a good presentation. We've not received any questions. I'm not aware of any in the chat. One raised hand. Who's that?
Right, it's Mark Sommerfeld from the REA, and sorry if you covered this, but I just wanted to be clear. What kind of powers do you / the DNOs have if people aren't registering, and if that doesn't happen automatically?
People aren't registering for what in particular, Mark?
Well, I mean, so you know, you've got the register there, you've got your unique identifier. If people aren't cooperating, what happens?
Oh, if other DNO, or so, are you saying, so if some, let's say WPD, for example, have something on the register that works quite well, and then why wouldn't another DNO adopt it, is it?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of what powers are there to make sure that this is working effectively is kind of what I'm asking. Who has overall power and control over it?
Well, it is a license condition, so Ofgem will be reviewing it. So ultimately they would have one, and we would have to justify to themselves why we wouldn't actually take something forward from that. But we're in the very early stages of this. It's a new license condition, and we've all just published it. But we will be doing a review in future of everyone and what they are doing. I haven't seen a particular thing from Ofgem yet where we have to put down all the activities and justify exactly where, but I believe that there will be something along those lines just to make sure we're all learning from this register itself.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you. That's helpful.
Are there any further questions for Gareth? Rita or Christos? Come to that matter. Chiamaka? Want to ask your question?
Quick question. So is there going to be like methodology for how you justify taking it forward or not in terms of the coordination? Because I'm just thinking, like, I know you said that it should benefit the whole system and it shouldn't just be applicable to one user. So I'm just thinking maybe like if there is a pathfinder that benefits a user that has quite a big impact on the system, that is still the one user, but the impact is quite considerable from that one user. So what happens in that instance? So I guess my question is just like, how are you measuring the justification process?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, if a pathfinder is successful, let's say you're procuring a particular service, whether it's voltage control or reactive power service or something like that, and the trial itself or the actual activity is proven to be possible, then it's envisioned that every time a DNO is looking and saying, oh, actually we have a voltage issue or we have a reactive power issue, then they will go onto the whole system register and log to see if anything has been done. So it could be that the DNO or the TO in question promotes it very heavily and we're all aware of it in the industry, or it could be that it is, logged on this, and when we're actually, each DNO themselves are looking to procure that service as well, they would look at the register, see it and say, oh, they've done it themselves, what did they learn from it, what was positive, what was negative, and it's hoped that that they would engage with the relevant DNO and TO to have a meeting and discuss what lessons learned or anything they can improve on. So at the moment, it's about opening up collaboration. It's not definitive things we have to log, but it's about kind of signposting where good work is taking place.
I've got thumbs up there, Gareth. So thank you very much. If there's no further questions, it remains for me to thank the presenters for very informative presentations. We can move to the next slide, please, where I can outline the next steps for these particular products. So taking them in turn, if we look at the whole system distribution energy scenarios, I think what's happened there, we've agreed a reduced set of building blocks going forward for this year's DFESs, which will then be published later on in the year. It varies depending on DNOs, but that then will be feeding into the National Grid FES based on those building blocks. So really, this is quite a mature product now, and it's year-on-year improvement. The two newer products are P5 and P9, and both of them are published as required by the license. Their reports will be, they're both reviewing what's happened and any feedback from stakeholder engagement like this and other, reviewing that feedback to look to see, as I think Rita described for the network development plan, how improvements can be made in subsequent publications of these plans and registers. So that's what's coming ahead in the future. So are there any final questions or any other business before I close today's session? Mark, you've got a question for me, or one of the presenters? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's a kind of high-level question relating to all of these. Obviously, the different DNOs are busy developing these publications. Obviously, later on in the year, we're expecting a significant consultation from government on REMA, on the review of electricity markets.
Yeah.
How do you expect DNOs to take that review into account in line with, you know, the development of their network development plans and the whole electricity system coordinating register piece and all of that? It seems to me that there's something coming down the line that could disrupt what they're staying within these plans and scenarios.
Yeah, I mean, we'll have to see what the outcome of the REMA work is. I think at the moment we are developing these particular plans on the basis of what we know now to give the best information that we can give. Obviously, if things were to change, if you look at the reports, at least the future energy scenarios and the network development plan, they are what they are. Mm-hmm. In terms of that's how we think the network will develop. This is what we think the requirements in terms of a forecast will be. So I think those will remain fairly as they are. I think that there may be a bit of change on the coordination register, but we'll have to just wait and see what comes out of REMA and respond when that comes apparent.
That's fine. I think the only ask I think there would, for maybe the ENA to have that in mind at the end of the year, to maybe look back and see what REMA has done and how that still coordinates, and maybe within next year's plans that has to be incorporated somehow. But you know, the major problem in the industry right now is there's so much going on. There's almost too much going on.
Yes, I agree with that. We are as Open Networks as a whole project looking to significantly review what work we'll be doing next year, and of course the REMA work will form a integral part of that review, along with the final determinations that will come out of the ED2 price review. So there's a number of things happening, as you say, almost too many, but we are trying to review our programme of work, taking into account as many things as we can for the future years.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Mark. Anybody else got a question? Okay, Well, it remains for me to once again thank the presenters, but also thank you all stakeholders for taking part in this webinar today. I hope you found it informative and useful. And if you have any other questions that you probably not thought to ask now, but do think of later, please contact the ENA and we can directly, get a response to that question. So based on that, I'd just like to thank you all and goodbye.